once in a while. Mom was the predominant force in our life. And Mom had two and her older sister married. And we used to laugh at Charles said, "You never got any whippings. You was always the good one." But Mom used to whip me. Her favorite thing was an extension cord. She was out of the country. He said, "Mom gets you by the ear and she twists it and she whips you. You start jumping up and down. She said, 'Stand still while I'm whipping you.'" But he'd tell those, some of them were lies, some of them was just embellishments. We had a good time growing up. Grew up in the country, moved to Spencer, the big city, and walked off a schoolhouse hill in 1949 to open the new school, which is obsolete now, and turned it into the senior citizens here in Spencer. And we used to play in the hills around Spencer. And Charles was always the first one that had to get there. So we had made grapevine swings the year before, and come spring up Ben's Run, they call it now, got a big walking trail up there. We made trails up there before they ever thought about that. So it was early spring, and we were going to go back to the grapevine swings. And he said, "I'll get it first." And he ran, he grabbed that thing, swung out, and gave that Tarzan yell, and that thing come out of the top of the tree. He went about 20 feet down the hill. Just a roll. But we moved out of Spencer up to Berwick, Ohio. Don't know, well, Karen's and Audrey lived up there. Mom and Herman get married and moved up there, going to better ourselves. I don't think much better than West Virginia, really, but we got along, and boys up there just like boys down here, they're ornery in heck. We'd run and play and have a good time. But unfortunately, you grow up. And I graduated from high school. I was 17 years old. Minimum wage in 1954 was 75 cents an hour if you could find a job. So my brother-in-law, Nelson Parsons, from out around Clover, had enlisted in the Air Force. He was doing good. So my buddy Bill Bland, he was the only one that really took a liking to the high boys, but he always called me Hillbill, because I was from West Virginia. Bill and I went down to the recruiting office. We were laying on the front lawn of the old high school there. Our graduating class was 21 people. I was in the top 10% of the class. 10%'s only 2. We went down to there, see the Air Force recruiter in Tiffin High. It was about lunchtime, and he was out to lunch. The Marine recruiter sitting there. "What are you boys looking for?" All said, "We're going to enlist in the Air Force." I said, "That's good, man. That's a good deal. Come on, sit down. We'll talk a while you're waiting for him. He'll be back in an hour." Would a Marine recruiter lie to 2 boys? Yep. I wanted to be a medic in the Air Force, because that's what Nelson was. So now when you get down to Parris Island, you just tell them when they're assigning you that you want to be in the medical department. Okay. He didn't tell me the Marine Corps doesn't have a medical department. They're all Navy. But I told him anyway. 4 years later, Charles graduated from high school. 1958, about the same thing. Mom and Herman moved back here. Karen and Tommy, they were little then. graduated from McCutcheonville High School, same place, and come down here for the summer. Fooled around some of the people here, made friends, but the 12th of August, he went to South Charleston recruiting station, signed his name for 4 years Marine Corps service. I don't know whether I affected him in any way at all with enlisting in the Marine Corps or not, but he enlisted, and started his service, and they sent him to, he, went through his recruit training, his infantry training at Camp Geiger in North Carolina, everything. They assigned him to a Naval Aviation Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, Florida. Made him an aviation supply clerk. And that was his profession in the Marine Corps for 10 years. And I remember when Mike was talking about him riding with his feet out the window. We had left Naval Air Station, Glenview, Illinois, where I was stationed for 3 years. Drove to California so that the kids could meet their grandmother out there. And got a hold of Charles. He was stationed at El Toro, and he rode back with us. I was headed for Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, my next duty station. The kids laughed at him. We stopped at the hot dog stand. They had foot-long hot dogs. He got 3. We said, it's a yard of hot dogs. But he had, during his Marine Corps career, he had many duty stations with aviation units. He was a good Marine. He was what you shouldn't have been, they say. They tell you when you go in the military to keep your eyes open, your ears open, your mouth shut, and never volunteer. Never volunteer. He was a volunteer. And some of the certificates, accommodations he has here, he helped his units. And that gets you noticed. If you're going to be a career Marine, you get promoted. He made his promotions all along. In one instance, when his unit was a Marine Reconnaissance Squadron deployed to Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico, they noticed that when he was off duty, he's down at the maintenance shop, for the sheet metal shop, for the hydraulic shop, helping them out. And in 1965, we don't remember this, but in one of his awards is a award for a deployment to the Dominican Republic. We didn't have enough going on in 1965 over in Vietnam, where they were just landing the 3rd Marine Division, the 1st Infantry Unit organized. They had a lot of advisors there before. So President Johnson decided they'd go down to the Dominican Republic. They were having a little fuss among themselves, and take a Marine Infantry regiment, an air group, and get down there and separate them. He volunteered to go. He was assigned to Naval Air Station, New Orleans, which I think is in Belchase. And that's where he met his wife, Mary. One of Mary's older sisters had come from Canada, Newfoundland, Newfoundland, St. John's, Newfoundland. That's
Way out there.
and got the job in a restaurant there. And a few years later, Mary got out of high school, she joined her. And Charles, being the talker and the meter and the greeter, of course, they go in a restaurant. And those girls knew that the friendly, good service in a restaurant, you get good tips. And that's how they made their living. Well, he and Mary ended up getting married there. If you saw the clips, you saw the pictures of it. Mary was an entirely different girl. Background, polar opposite of Charles. I think. They were devoted to each other for life. And she was different. He catered to her every need. When she got up to go to work at 4:30 in the morning, he'd already been out and wiped the windshield of their car. And then he'd go to work in those oil rigs after he got out. But while they were married, there came up 1967. And at that time, I was up along the DMZ in Vietnam. DMZ stands for Demilitarized Zone. Supposedly. The young Marines had a name for it. It's called the Dead Marine Zone. And Charles, by some regulation, could not go to Vietnam till I left. They didn't want two brothers there at the same time. They tried that in the Second World War with 5 brothers in the Army at the same time, overseas at the same time, and several of them got killed. So he was waiting for me to come home. I don't know whether we passed on the way, but anyway, along in the 1st of March or the last of February, after I came home, he was sent to Vietnam. And he got to his unit sometime in the 1st week of March. It's a place called Phu Bai. And the town there was Hue City, the imperial capital of Vietnam, when they had a king. But what happened in January of 1967, the 31st of January, was called the Tet Offensive, or General Uprising. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap would whip the French in Indochina in 1954. He wiped out the last of the French resistance at a place called Dien Bien Phu. President Johnson called it, "There ain't gonna be no damn Dien Bien Phu on my watch." But they decided that the Marine outpost at Quai Son, which was manned by about 6,000 Marines, was one target, and Hue City, the imperial capital, was the only 2 targets wanted in Vietnam. Because that was a message to the American people. Of course, they went down through the rest of Vietnam, invaded it, attacked the American embassy in Saigon. So when he landed, the city of Hue was under siege, and the position at Quai Son, which was in the northwest corner, a few miles from North Vietnam, a few miles from Laos, was under siege, and they wanted to take those as a message to the American people. So that's what he entered when he went there. Went to a helicopter squadron, HMM 263, was the old CH-34, the last piston-driven helicopters ahead. And they were sort of like the little train that could. I think it can, I think it can, I think it can. You see that thing out there running up, loaded. They put the tilt on the rotors and it try to lift off and try to lift off and finally go. By this time, Charles was a staff sergeant, E6. He was a supply NCO for the squadron. He did not have to fly. But going by the records of his awards and stuff, I think that he was volunteered to fly in 2 squadrons at the same time. Now you see his air medal over there, a certificate for it. Had to fly 25 combat missions to get it. He had 2 of them meant to be flown at the very minimum. He'd been on 50 missions on a helicopter as a door gunner with an M60 machine gun. Why? He had it made. He could have stayed in the supply tent. Got him a cold beer maybe every night. Fuba was a big base. But they flew those old CH-34s all over the northern part of Vietnam and down to Da Nang around, delivering cargo, delivering troops. What you live on in combat is beans, bullets, and water. That's what they carried most. But when they came back, they brought the wounded back. And I just want to read you a couple of things. It says, the President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Air Medal, First Strike Flight Award to Staff Sergeant Charles E. Postalwait, United States Marine Corps, for meritorious achievement in aerial flight as a designated aerial gunner with Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 363 during combat support missions in support of the Republic of Vietnam against insurgent communist Viet Cong forces from 1 May 1968 to 3 June 1968. You can see on there a flight wing type thing. That is a combat airman's wings. Now, a crewman could wear those while he was in the unit and sign the flight duty. But when you wore them and you got 3 battle stars on them, they were yours for life. And that's his there with 3 battle stars. It says 25 May 1968 from the commanding officer to Staff Sergeant Charles E. Postalwait. Combat Air Crewman Wing certification up. You are hereby awarded Combat Airman Wings with 3 stars while serving the Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 165 as a regularly assigned CH-46 air crew member engaged in offensive operations against communist guerrilla forces in the Republic of Vietnam during the period 1 through 19 May 68. So in 19 days, he earned his 3 battle stars, his flight wing. And then he got those. We got a picture of him standing in formation that flew by and the commanding officer gave him his wing. His 2 air medals, he got the last one in 1969. They finally got it to him. The first one was sometime in 1968. He was discharged in August of 1968. So he never got to wear those on his uniform, but he earned them. What a young man went through, and people say war. People like me and Ken Westfall don't know anything about war. That's for the presidents, secretaries of defense, prime ministers to talk about war. We talk about combat. Personal things. The thought of war was the furthest thing from our mind. I just want to try to tell you a little story here about him when he was with the CH-34 squadron. He transferred to the 46s, or the heavier helicopters, twin rotors. And his squadron there were the go-to squadron for inserting and extracting reconnaissance teams. They had the expertise, their pilots were well trained, they were brave. They could go and winch a 6-man team out, hovering under fire. And they wouldn't pull out and leave it. They'd try to get every one of them out. But while he was serving in the 034s, 26 March of 1968, I'm going to try to tell this as a story, this is the log from the operations department where they logged important things during the day. So the day was a tragic one for HMM 363. At approximately 02:50 in the morning, Fubai come under intense rocket attack. The first rockets to hit scored direct hits on the officers there. Heavy casualties were received. Among those wounded was Lieutenant Colonel Allgood, commanding officer of HMM 3. That was their commanding officer. That was their leader. And evidently he was a good one too. When you read their logs, he logged just as many flight hours as the rest of his pilots. He didn't sit in the seat and run the admin part of it. He flew. But he was hit in the head. They took him to, the squadron had one surgeon assigned to the squadron. He looked at him and said, "It's grave." So they had the Alpha Company 3rd Medical Battalion was there. It was just a hospital in tents. So they took him and the rest of the wounded there. And they decided it was so bad that they would evacuate them down to Da Nang, where the Naval Support Activity had a big hospital. And they had facilities for head wounds. So they had 2 choppers on medevac standby. Medevac means medical evacuation. So they got those fired up, and they loaded the Lieutenant Colonel Allgood and 2 other wounded men with head wounds on one chopper. They had 2 Navy hospital corpsmen to take care of on the way. The lead chopper, they loaded 2 on and 1 Navy hospital corpsman. So you had a pilot, a co-pilot, the crew chief, and the gunner, 3 wounded, and 2 Navy hospital corpsmen. They took off, said the weather was bad. The ceiling was 500 feet. They were leaving at 5:10 in the morning, pitch dark. Instead of trying to fly over the mountains, they went out to sea and fly down and come back into Da Nang. they had gone, just got out into the flight, and Major Harrison, the flight leader and the pilot of the lead helicopter, he said Major Harrison reported immediately that his wingman was down at 090 degrees radial, TACAN channel number 39 at 30 miles. The chopper crashed at sea. The pilot and the co-pilot got out somewhat. They launched the search and rescue choppers out of Da Nang. They could not find the crew members or the wounded or the corpse. That was for one day in his life. Early morning. So, the Major Hoffert was the next senior officer in the squadron. He flew up from Quang Tri, where they were flying out of another city on that, and assumed command. So everybody's going to sit down and grieve, right? No. Says the daily routine was disrupted, but missions were flown at Quang Tri and Phubai. Major Fileski and Captain Heyer led sections flying admin, which carried 7 U.S. passengers, 2 Vietnamese civilians, passengers, and 1,000 pounds of cargo. 2 aircraft from Phubai, piloted by Lieutenant Kessler and Lieutenant Colford, flew in section with Scarface aircraft moving passengers. Scarface was the Huey chase planes, gunships that escort. They had to go ahead and put in a full day's work after losing that many men. Charles was a good Marine. His record shows. And he was a volunteer. He didn't sit back and let somebody else do it. The tale is told about one of our supply sergeants. We didn't get enough rations up to our position one day, so they weren't available. But you go back to Phubai, the same base, this supply sergeant is in his tent, and he's rigged all the ration cartons around it to make him a blast wall. So if an artillery shell come in, he might be safe. But he's short of us in the field rations. Charles wouldn't do that. He never had to fly one flight, and he flew way more than 50. And anytime you went out in a helicopter in Vietnam, you were subject to be fired on. Just that's simple. Charles came back home and never said a word what he did. He went on with his life, went down to New Orleans, get on those old, they were building shallow offshore rigs. They take an old river barge, steel, bring it in, cut it up, and they build everything on it. I bet you 2 dump trucks wouldn't haul the welding rods that he burned up, sitting there in the hot sun. Crippled up his knees, crippled up his feet. He never complained. Never asked for anything. He did go to one of her veterans dinner over to Penile Church. Ken was there and I was there and some others. Never said that he'd ever been in combat. Never really said that he'd been in the Marine Corps. And The sad thing is my opinion, and I know my opinion's not much. Not many people care. Not many people care what people like Charles did. That's just a little part of his life. But I think it's an important part that we don't forget. We're still taking young men out of high school, training them to be soldiers or sailors or Air Force, and sending them overseas to do the dirty work for politicians. And I don't think we should forget it. I don't think we should forget about our family. You know, if you look around here today and you see everybody sitting here, and you come back next week, you will never be assembled the same again. We're all passing. We're just passing through, and we don't know whether we're going to get home tonight. So we ought to tell our people we love them. Ought to try to make up old griefs and complaints and stuff. Forget about that. Love each other. You know, it wouldn't hurt us right now to turn around to our neighbor and say, I love you. You know, we're family. We're not all family by blood relations, but we're all a family here. And I just wanted to honor Charles a little bit by telling what he did do.